me a specific rant or delete, and then create and update, right? Typical CRUD. You can see this code in GitHub as well, okay? But nothing fancy, right? So that's all great. I tested, so this is fantastic, right? Here, all my different stories, okay? You can see here that I have a description of my rants VI API, and while that works, I can actually show you how to execute them. So I can go to the test folder, and I can see that there's an integration folder, and there's API v1, and I can actually execute that as rants. We'll let it execute, and you can see that I have a lot of stories, right? Getting a list of rants, getting an individual rant, creating a rant, updating a rant, and deleting a rant, right? And each of these stories, as I start describing them, right, they basically have different scenarios, right? So this one, for example, says, given I make a call to API rants view, when I pass a no rant ID, I will get a 412. Or when I pass an invalid rant ID, I will get a 412. Or when I pass a valid but not existing rant ID, right? So I start going and digesting all this and actually executing my API, right? With this gets that you can see here, right? I'm actually executing the API from within my virtual test application and getting the results. And then I can go in here and I can see, I have a little warning here that I wanted to leave so you can see what happens if there is something, right? The case is not valid. And of course, it's not valid because I'm using uppercases right now. But you can see that all my BDD tests are there in place for that version. That was the important part. Okay? And that's important because those BDD tests are going to be your true indicator if you're breaking your tests or not, okay, when you start refactoring. All right, so this is V1. I made it work. I used a reusable tool. It gave me lots of cool stuff, right? I can actually have a route visualizer here that's part of the template. So I can go to route visualizer. And this is something really cool. It can actually show you all the different routes for the different versions of the API. So you can see them here of everything that's in the API. So here's V1. It has a V1's router. So you can see all the different URL endpoints, okay, for everything in your application, okay? Apart from that, I was executing a bunch of stuff, and I also have the CB debugger turned on as well on my application. And this allows me to actually see all the different requests that I'm making into my API. So you can see here all the different requests I'm making to the API, and then I can actually see, how much memory, which API event actually created, right? What happened on that API. I can actually go into it, and I can actually see what was executed within the framework. I can see the HTTP request that was made, right? I can see the headers that were requested. I can see, all my information. I can even see my database queries from Adobe right here, right? I can actually see that the rant service made an execution call with these values on that specific line number, and I can even link it to VS Code. I can actually take me to that line of code that actually made that specific SQL execution, okay? So all these tools are available to me just by the template. I didn't build them. Well, I actually did build them, but I didn't have to build them right now, right? Basically, they're there for me to reuse, okay? Right? So that's an example right here of V1. All right. So what can I do, right? I made it work. But I know my JavaScript developers are shouting at me. They don't like the response objects I've created, right? I've done a lot of code, right? There's some type of code smell going on here. So what can I do? So let's look at a V2. And I basically say, okay, what can I do? Well, first of all, my URL endpoints are kind of yucky, right? I'm relying still on conventions, which relies on the names of methods. I don't want to do that, right? I want to refactor by using a router, right, and actually use real routes, right? I don't want to depend on the actual names of files. I want to use array of structs. I don't want to use the queries. Love queries, but in this case, I just want to return array of structs. My get operations, I want a structs. I don't want arrays. I don't want queries. I want structs. I can start refactoring to maybe eliminate some temporary variable assignments I really don't need. And since I'm doing a lot of validation, man, that's a lot of work. And you know what? Maybe I want to do some gaming tonight. I want to need more time. So I'm going to use CV validation. So I'm just going to use the validation module to just do that for me. And I'm going to start basically using exist functions instead of trying to get every single record. Okay, and of course I'm going to use get functions as well for consistency and more BDD tests. All right, so let's see how this code evolves. So I'm going to leave v1 here, and I'm going to open v2. So let's look at our router, and let's start by comparing our routers first, right? So we're going to compare our routers, and we can see here that on our left, we have just our entry point and conventions, and now on our right, we actually becoming very specific. And I'm saying, hey, I want to use a post, and when I use a post HTTP method, I want you to wait for rants.create and execute the rants.create handler action. If I use a delete with this incoming URL, rant/rant ID, so that's a delimiter, or a symbol. This actually comes from the Ruby on Rails approach. I'm going to expect a rant ID and a delete, then call the delete. Okay. If I have a save, there you go. If it's a get for a specific rant, and then basically goes from the most specific to the less specific. All right, so now our router has improved. I can actually verify that in our router, right? Because we have our router. Where did our router go? Open the router. Okay, so we open v2. We can see that the router for v2 has all these URL entry points available to me, and I can see which event it's going to execute. Okay, great. I can see that as a developer, I'm improving my URLs. Right now, it's more fluent, more human readable. Okay, great. All right, let's move on. So apart from our router, we'll see that we have our models. Let's see if they changed. Let's look at our rant service and let's see how it changed, okay, through this refactor. So we can see that things are changing. So first of all, I'm not using queries anymore. I'm using a really amazing feature of Adobe ColdFusion, which is to return that specific SQL directly as an array, okay? So I just pass in the options and say return type array, and now my list function will return me an array of structs. Beautiful. And then here on my get operation, I start getting a little bit more fluent because I say, hey, when I query execute this, I want to reduce that row, okay? And I just want to return that specific row, okay? So I'm reducing, or I'm changing, right, the query, native query right here into just a struct, okay? And if there's nothing found with that ID, give me an empty struct. That's pretty much it, right? This is a little bit of spacing, right? I can see that pretty much everything's working, just a few names. And then I just have an exist function. And the exist function basically says, does this ID exist as a rant? And gives me a Boolean true or false. Right, so it's improving, right? That's great. Let's look at my handlers now. Let's see how those handlers have evolved now. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the rants one. Left is the one, and the right is going to be v2. Okay, so you can see that the dependency injection is still the same, it's just a different version. We can see here that I eliminated a temporary variable. Why am I going to create a temporary variable? Why? Nothing. It makes no use. I'm just going to direct it in line. So you can see here now it's a little bit more fluent. I can say response, give me the data of the rant service.list. So it reads from left to right. Okay, great. Let's look at the view. The view changed quite a lot. Look at that. Okay, so what changed here? Okay, so we can see that now we're using a special function called validate. Where did that come from? Well, validate, it comes from the CV validation module. It's already installed in this application. That function appears magically. It's available to you magically. They're called magic functions. And I have a validate function now. I can pass a target. What am I validating? Well, I'm validating the incoming variables that are coming through the URL or form. And I'm putting some constraints. What do I want to validate? I want to look for a rant ID, which is required, and it has to be of type UUID. Okay, great. That's all I do. I don't have to be doing all this validation manually anymore, right? And then if there is errors, okay, so if this validation had errors, then I'm going to set the error message on the response to be the validation response errors and my status code, okay? One line, great. If I pass those constraints now, you can see that now instead of saying get rant, I just used a function called get, okay? I'm becoming less verbose there because I'm using the rant service. So it reads rant service get this rant ID, okay? That's my rant. If it's not empty, right, then I'm going to set that to be returned as my response. And then if not, it's a 404. Okay. It's more readable and it's a lot less code, as you can see. Okay. If we look at the actual delete, same idea. Okay. A lot less code. I'm refactoring. Look at the create. It's a lot less code, right? So I'm doing a lot less validation manually. Okay. I'm starting going through it, and my save operation for my update, well, a lot less code as well. Okay. So I can see definitely that I'm improving upon my software here, and of course my BDD tests should be there as well. So I can close this, and I can see that now I have API v2, and I can go and leave those executing, right? But I have v2 here tests as well, and they might change a bit, right? And they also change because now I'm using not queries, I'm using arrays of structs, right? So even these guys have differences as well, because I had that magic word, refactoring, right? You can see here that I'm obviously using v2, right? But it's not a query anymore, it's an array now. That's what I'm expecting. My endpoints are now changing because I'm using that specific URIs, right? So I'm adapting my BDD test to making sure that my requirements, as I refactor and I go through these, that they still work. Okay, so this is really, really important. That will be the way to approach it. All right, so this is V2. It's doing a lot of great stuff. Okay, so we now have a router, right? We have an array of structs. We're not using queries anymore. I'm not using verbosity in the names of my functions. I'm using retrieval operations, right? I'm starting to eliminate those temporary variable assignments that really do nothing. Okay, I'm using validation, a validation framework, instead of actually trying to do all my validations by hand, right? And of course, more BDD tests. Right, great. This is a huge improvement, right? So let's move on and say, okay, but I can do better. Okay, I know I can do better. So let's look at version 3. Okay, what am I going to be doing in version 3 to improve my fluency, to improve this human approach to this API? Well, there's this concept, and not only in ColdBox, but in a lot of frameworks out there, in the majority of them now, which is called resourceful routes. And resourceful routes is basically predictable routing. It's becoming really a standard, or to become a uniformity on how routes work. And we'll show you a little bit of that, how it works. And basically allows you to adhere to these standards to have less boilerplate. Okay? It means that predictable resourceful routes determine the HTTP method and the name of the route, and it will point it to your handlers and methods by convenience. Okay? I'm also going to introduce a base service. I'm starting to see that my services have a lot of overlaps. So I'm going to basically go into encapsulation abstraction mode and start creating more methods just to assist me when building my API, because this is just 2 endpoints. Imagine if I had 50. I'm going to use, instead of validate, I'm going to use validate or fail, okay, which is another function in CB validation, because right now I had to do a little bit of manual work. So if you look at rants, and I do here the validation results, I still had to do an if statement. Okay, I don't want that if statement, right? I basically want to use that validate or fail because I know that the REST handler has a nice interception point for when validation exceptions are there. So when validation exceptions are met, or somebody throws a validation exception, it automatically will throw and look at the response object and send that bad request to the user. So I can take advantage of that and write less code. So I'm going to take advantage of the validate or fail. And you can see that when I show you this code of V3, the human and Fluent levels are going to be definitely increasing. Okay, so let's go and let's actually start comparing my versions. Okay, so we're going to close V1. We're going to focus on V2 and V3. And we're going to start again with the routers, right? So we're going to say, what did we do in the routers? Okay, we went from basically documenting every single endpoint for a CRUD. Imagine if I had 50 of these, right? And I'm going to use the, of course, resourceful routes. Okay, and resourceful routes, I put the link here in the docs. You can click on it and you can actually see all the documentation of what it is. And it basically allows you to say, hey, API resources, build me the resources for a user, for photo, for grants, for whatever endpoint you want to create. It will create the specific route according by convention, and basically creating the event for you and all the documentation for you. So this is standard. I can say resource, the name is rants, and I want a specific parameter name of rant ID. Okay, and just by doing that, all those resources are going to be created for me. So if I actually go to my route visualizer and I go to V3, and I open the router, you will see that they're there. Okay, rants/rant ID. There's the different. It goes to that handler, but the handler splits according to the specific HTTP action. So if the HTTP action is a delete, I will execute delete. If it's a get, it's a show. If it's a put, it's an update. And if it's a patch, it's an update. Okay. Same for /rants. Okay. If it's a post, it's a create. If it's a get, it's an index. Now the cool thing about the resourceful routes is that if you're working with any framework out there, they all adhere to this standard. Okay. Whether it's Ruby on Rails, whether it's Grails, whether it's Laravel, whether it's Express, it doesn't matter. This is adhering to those standards. So this is a plus, okay? All right, so we know that we're using those resources. One line, we get all those resources. Okay, great. All right, let's go deeper here. All right, let's start with our handlers here. Okay, let's see how these evolved. Okay, let's look at the rants, and let's compare them, and let's see how they evolved. All right, so we can see that the dependent injection, of course, changed. The name of the method changed. Okay, not a big deal, okay? But let's look at a view. A view went from, what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 lines of code to 2. Okay, a big improvement and nice readability. I basically say validate or fail, right? As you can see from here, right? And I say, I want you to validate the request collection coming in with the RAN ID, which is a UUID, but it will fail. So that means that I'll let the REST handler deal with the response. And, right, when I actually do a rant service to show that specific rant, I use another fail, which is get or fail. But this I wrote manually, so I'll show it to you. So now it's becoming really nice, because now I can say, hey, validate or fail this response, or set the data for this rant service, whether you get it or fail it. Great. All right, improvement, right? Delete. Again, a lot of improvement. Validate or fail, exist or fail, delete it, or add a message, and we're going. Creation looks a lot nicer, okay? You can see from left to right, right? I can use the same approach, validate or fail. I'm validating 2 specific constraints now. I can do an exist or fail, right? And then, of course, I can get my data message and send it back. And the same for update. All right, so huge improvements just at the handler level, which is really more fluent, less verbose, human readable, lot less code to deal with, okay? So less error prone, okay? And we can move now into the models. All right, so let's see how these models evolve. Well, first of all, we introduced the base service. We did not have this here. So what we did is that we've created this base service, and all we're saying is, hey, I want to know which table where I'm dealing with, what's the primary key, and what is the service that I'm going to be dealing with in abstraction mode, right? And I added this module name because obviously I'm building a multi-version approach here, right? I want to be able to link to several modules. This is optional. But let's look at the function exists. The exists takes in an ID, and I basically, hey, I select the primary key from the table name, right? Where the primary key is what I passed in, and then it tells me if it exists or not. Okay, nice abstraction. I don't have to care about which table it is or which primary key it is. Exist or fail basically just checks if it exists, and if it doesn't, it throws a very specific exception. Entity not found. Okay, and this entity not found is something, again, that the actual tools help you with. Okay, so if we look at the REST handler and we're going to look for entity not found, you'll see that it's basically intercepted for me, and it will produce a 404 for me because it says, hey, that entity was not found. It does all the code for you for that response, right? I don't have to write it. Great. As long as that type is there. Okay. Same for get or fail. I retrieve a get, and if it's not empty, then I throw the exception. Here's the get, which is abstracted, right? And a delete that's abstracted. So my base service is now kind of becoming my mini ORM here, right? Which is giving and working with all these abstractions. That's a big improvement. If we look at the user service and compare them, you'll see that now I extend, of course, from my base service. I initialize myself with specific bindings, right? Which table, which version I'm on. And then you can see I actually removed the code, right? That code is gone, right? Let's look at the rant service, right? So rant service left and right, so you can see them. And now I can see that I'm evolving, right? No more get, I just leave the list, and my create is just formatted a little bit nicer. But that's it, right? So I'm introducing these abstractions to make my code more flexible, and I can move forward. All right, great. All my tests are there, everything is there, but let's move on. We can do better. All right, V4. Let's move on to V4. So in V4, I'm not going to be working with just arrays of structs. I want to create entities to really model behavior. Okay, I want to apply my object principles here. There's other things I want to do in order to improve my relationships when I'm working with data. Okay, I want better visualization of really what a rant is and what a user is. I want to encapsulate those constraints. My constraints are pretty much everywhere in my handlers. What if I needed to do that in 40 handlers? Not good for reusability, so I want to encapsulate them at the appropriate entity. I want to, instead of using the array of structs, I want to control what I marshal to the user. So I'm going to create a memento, which is based on the memento pattern. It's just basically retrieving a state from that object. How do I want it to be marshaled? And since I'm going to be working with objects, I need something to populate them, right? And of course, our handy populator is built into Wirebox. It's there. Basically allows me to inflate queries to objects or anything of that nature, right? And now I can basically return a full memento of an entity, of a rant, on create and updates instead of just the ID. Okay, so more improvements coming our way. So let's see these improvements, how they compare. Well, our router has not changed. We haven't done anything with the router, so we're going to skip it. We're going to look at our handler first. Okay, so in V4, okay, we're going to see that we still have our injection, but we're starting to change a little bit our response. So instead of saying just list, we're going to list, and then we're going to map the response by iterating through each of those arrays and basically retrieving what we specifically want, the state that we want. Okay, and this comes from requirements where it says, I don't want you to bring everything from the database, just specific items from the database. Okay, what if you don't want to show the password, right? Of course, hopefully you don't want to show the password or the username, etc. Right? These are true requirements, right? Same goes for the show, right? Now I want to retrieve what I want to be able to marshal in my response object, okay? You can see here now when I have to actually create one, I actually create a new rant object. I validate the incoming constraints as well. You can see that the constraints are now coming from the rant object. I'm not writing them in line. Then populating that rant with a body and the user ID that comes in, create it, and then I'm going to marshal it with a memento. Okay, so I'm starting to change a little bit of this, right? Real life scenarios here, right? I don't want to be sending everything back to the user. I'm going to be selecting just what I want. Okay, so how does that look like? Okay. So let's look at our models now. Okay, and now we have a rant and a user object. Look at a rant object. You can see now that it basically has all the properties that I want to marshal. Okay, everything that it should be in the database. It has my validation constraints embedded into it, so I know how this entity will validate. I have some defaults for it, which I didn't have before, right? I can actually link it to the specific user, so now I'm dealing with relationships at runtime. Before, I just had a random ID for the user. Now I can actually retrieve the user object and actually interact with it. I can tell if this entity has been loaded from the database or not, right? And here's the magical memento. I actually get to choose what I want to send back in my response, okay? So I build out my response of how I want it with the formatting I want, and then I send it back. Okay, that seems great, right? So you can see that now this actually executes as well. So we'll go to V5, V4. Okay. Oh, it's not view, it's just rants. Producing our stuff. You can see that I have there now, you can see the case has changed, of course, because it comes from the memento, right? And I can decide what comes out, right? So if you want to change here, right here, and you don't want, for example, the use of let's say the created date, you want to eliminate it, right? I can come in here, right? And I can eliminate it from that specific memento, right? And it won't show up once it marshals, okay? It's now gone, right? So lots of improvements I'm making on my API version here. And I know I have about 11 minutes left, so I want to make sure I can cover at least the other versions here, and then we can open for QA. But I'm evolving, right? Everything's starting to evolve. I'm adding, things to improve my quality of life, real life requirements, right? How to actually choose which response to actually do. No, I don't want to send everything, right? So V4 is really nice. It's getting to a state where I'm very satisfied with it. Everybody's happy with me, and but I can do better. So let's look at another iteration here. So let's look at V5. Okay, V5 we're going to get a little bit more funky here. Okay, we're going to be doing population. Okay, because you saw that I was calling a bunch of setters. I don't want to be calling a bunch of setters. They're predictable. So let's remove that boilerplate. I'm going to use a pre-handler for parameter incoming variables, right? I don't want to be dealing with any type of me setting up those variables. I'm gonna prepare them, and I'm gonna stop building that data manually. I use that get memento, but we have a project called the mementifier, which is a module, and it allows you to build state. Okay, and it gives you many rules, and you can very flexible. And basically, that's its job. It's produce the right state out of the right objects for you, even relationships. Okay. I'm also going to create a new, because now that I wanted to create something, I can see that the user service had a new, the rand service had a new. Imagine if you had 5 more responses, then you got more news. So I can abstract that and pull it into the base service. But you can also see that since I'm creating entities now, right, or things that represent my responses, why don't I create a base entity? And I want to make things also fluent, right? Because I want to deal with that entity, right? So I can create a base entity with a get or fail, with a validate or fail that can populate itself, that can save itself, and that can delete itself. Okay. So I'm starting to get a little bit more funky here, just for the sake of encapsulation and making things more nicer, as my API is going to definitely grow in complexity, right? So let's move to V5. Router stays the same. We haven't done any work at the router level. But before we look at the handlers, let's look at the models this time around. So now I don't have a base entity here, but I do here. So let's look at the base entity. So in the base entity, I basically define a little bit of metadata. I say I'm going to know which primary key I'm working with, which entity I'm working with, the service, and the module name, right? So these are things like I want to know that I'm going to work with in every entity. I want to talk to Wirebox. I want to know how to populate. And for some reason, I want to talk to Callbox, and we'll see how that works. We have the memento. So this is basically saying for any entity built in my system, never include a password and never include this metadata, but always include the rest of the properties. Okay, so by default, I can marshal everything in my system. My constructor is basically taking some metadata. You can see here that I can inflate the actual service that I'm going to be working with once this entity is loaded. I can still validate if an entity exists. I can still get an ID from my objects. Now I have a population. So you can see there that I can populate from the incoming request, right, into the actual object that I'm working with. And I can validate or fail. I can talk to validation manager. So I'm kind of encapsulating these things into my entity, right? I can do a save, which you can see here. If it's loaded, that means if I have a UUID for this object, then call an update. If not, call a create. And then if not, I can call a delete. So I've created a lot of encapsulation here because I don't want to repeat myself. Okay? And then in the base service, you'll see that it's pretty much the same, right? Except we have a new now, which can deal with any type of service. It can actually create a new object, but I can also pass in all the properties. Okay, and I can populate it with the properties right there and there. Okay, and then I can do, of course, my exist or fail, my get or fail are still the same, right? On my base service. Right, so let's look at the rant. So the rant now inherits from my base. I know which user service I'm going to be working on. I can have constraints, and my constraints are funky now because I know that I'm going to have a body, which is required. But look at this. With the constraints, I can say I want a user ID, right, which tells me which user this rant is for. But I can also do a validation in line to making sure that that UUID actually exists in the database. So right there, I'm moving that exists code from the handler into the constraint because that allows me to encapsulate all the constraints right here for that rant. So it doesn't matter which handler uses this, the rant cannot be saved until this validates. Okay, this gives me uniformity here. Okay, I can see that I can basically just say, hey, I want to initialize with this entity. right? And you can see here at the bottom that I can get a user, right? Uh-oh, and I'm having some trouble. Can you still hear me?
I can still
down.
I can still see and hear you, Luis. So I'm not sure what's going on your end.
Weird. Internet spasm. All right, so there you go. So I have a little bit of relationships here. You can see I have a get user and a has user, right? But there is no memento, right? There is no more get memento call. So again, that comes from the mementifier, right? So if we look at our handler now and we compare them, okay, you will see that now I have a pre-handler that basically says that a rant ID is going to be necessary for these actions, okay? And now I've actually removed the constraints right here. Look at that. They're removed from the show because I'm using the params. And then I can do the same thing, get or fail with the memento. Okay, this comes from that project, that module, mementifier. And it works the same way. It actually does it where you want to marshal. And you can see that I'm improving how it reads. Look at this create one. The create one looks a lot better because I can say rant service, give me a new rant according to the incoming variables, validate it or fail it, and then save it. And then for the response, give me that memento. So I'm starting to be more fluent, okay? A lot readable. Okay, you can see here for an update, I get or fail the specific rant ID I requested. I populate it from the incoming data, and I'm excluding the ID, validate it or fail it, and then save it, okay? So all this, by adding those specific functions in my base objects, I can actually have more readable code here instead of on the left, okay? So when any developer comes in here and reads it, it's a lot more readable. Plus, I can actually move those functions, right? So what I'm doing is I'm going for functional programming here, and I can move this, right? If I want to validate it first, I can validate it first, right? I can move these functionals anywhere, and I can actually navigate to those pieces of code that could be tested, right? So if I wanted to say the save operation, it takes me to the save operation right here, right? And of course, VS Code is magic at that, right? But lots of improvements. Right, and of course, from the user standpoint, right, everything is improving here. Okay. Here's my V5. That's for a specific rant, right? The memento is still working, as you can see, right? But let me show you something. If I actually want to view a specific rant, so let me grab this guy, right? And I want to see it, right? It'll still work. You can see here, but I have a problem now because I'm giving back to my JavaScript developers the user ID. So what this means is that now basically they have to do another call to figure out what the heck that user ID is, right? So, okay, I can do better. So let's look at the final iteration here, right? And we want to do better on improving this. Yeah, I'm getting a lot of slowdowns here for some reason.
Hey, Luis, just a heads up. We've got about 2 minutes. And on our end, we're actually, at least for my view, I'm not seeing any issues in terms of your video or audio or your share.
Actually, can you still hear me?
I can hear it. I can still see your share.
All right. Well, my machine's stuck, so give me a bit. I don't know what's going on, but
Uh-oh.
Let's see if it revives. Give me 1 second. But at least you can hear me, right?
I absolutely can hear you. Are all those tabs on the bottom open? Is that all your open tabs?
No, I actually something's going on. So give me 1 second. I think it's reviving.
No problem.
All right. Can you still see my share?
I can. I see your mouse going around. You know, I think maybe your share got frozen.
Okay. All right. Should I stop the share and start it again?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Let's stop the share and have you give it another shot.
All right. Leave everybody intrigued with the last version.
That's right.
All right. How about now?
Got it.
Okay, great. All right. So final version, then we'll do a little bit of Q&A here. So what can I improve here? So in version 6, I'm going to also create a catch-all resource because if people are poking around in my API, I want to let them know that that resource doesn't exist. And I want to use the mementifier to do runtime includes and excludes to help the JavaScript developers. And I also want to do those relationships to make it nicer. I'm going to add a little bit more fluency, and I want to add some caching because I know I'm going to get to deployment soon here. But most importantly, I want to document this. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to document using Swagger, and of course, how to import that into several tools. So I'm going to go back in here and go to V6. And on V6, we'll see that the router has changed very, very simply by adding a catch-all resource. By just saying anything. That means that any route that doesn't intercept right above here will basically go into this route and say on invalid route. That's it. That's very simple, letting the tool do the work in order for me to do invalid routes. I'm not going to delve into that more, but I am going to delve into my models here. So let's look at the rant, okay, and how that changed, because now I want to do relationships. So you can see here that what I've done is in my init, I not only initialized it, but I also determined which to include when marshalling this object. I don't want to return an ID. I want to alias it using that colon to rant ID. So instead of actually seeing an ID right here, right, I want a rant ID. I want the body, of course, the created date and the update date, but now I want a user. So how do I get that user? Well, I already had a get user, which returned to me the user that I'm linked to, and that's it. The mementifier knows that it's a complex object, and it's going to mementify the user for me. Okay, so that's a big plus right here by just determining what I want to actually marshal. Okay, and then my handlers changed a bit. Okay, so let's look at the rants. Okay, and you can see here that basically I'm paramming 3 more variables: includes, excludes, and ignore defaults. And basically, I'm doing this to make this REST service responsive to whoever's calling it. Okay, and you can see here that now, when you look at my index, which is getting a list of rants, you'll now see first documentation. You can see that now I'm documenting the response in the annotations. Okay, and I'll tell you where that goes. I'm also adding caching parameters to make sure that this is cached every 60 minutes. And then I'm saying, hey, rant service, this, give me all the rants, and then map them to the memento, but I'm passing the includes, the excludes, and the ignores. All right, we'll see how that works. Right? You can see here the show. I'm adding more documentation for the types of responses that I can do, the parameters that I can do, same for the delete, and all these responses, where are they? Well, these are right here under resources. Under resources, by convention, there are API docs, and here's my API v6. Here's my rants. Here's my create. Here's my responses. Okay, here's my request body. Here's my example for a 400, and here's my example for a 200. So I'm adding all this documentation right here as a developer so I can actually build it, okay? Plus the caching, right? So that's all great. So how does that work? So let me go here to rants now in V6, right? And we'll show everything here, right? And now that I'm there, you can see that it has my create data, it has my rant ID, but look at that, I have an embedded user now. So all of these now get an embedded user of which user actually created that rant, right, with the body and the update date. Now, before, I had manually removed the create date, but I can do that now by saying, hey, I want you to exclude the created date, okay, because I'm passing it to the mementifier, and that excludes it. It's gone. You see? It's gone. Okay? If I don't want the user, I can say, hey, I don't need the user, right? And there's not the user anymore. So now my RESTful response is adapting to my needs. Okay, but you know what? I want to ignore ignore the defaults, right? And then I only want you to include the rant ID and the body, okay? So this basically goes in here and, oops, did I make a mistake here? Oop, yep, ignore defaults, okay? And there's the body, and of course I need the ID, sorry. And there it is. So now I can only return the ID and a body. Maybe this is for a dropdown, right? I don't need to return everything. I just need that ID and that body, right? So I can get very, very explicit in what I want, right? I can say, hey, only give me the user, right? And that will give me only the user, okay? Or if I want to say, I want you to now exclude from the user, don't show me the user.username, right? Then it excludes it. So all this is part of the state builder that is already built for me. I didn't have to build all this, right? Is there available for me to make my RESTful responses better for me, and for my developers that are building all these responses, right? How they can actually interact, even nested relationships, okay? And of course, if I actually now, to end this, if I can go to CD Swagger, right? But that endpoint that's part of the module, I have all my Swagger documentation built for me according to that documentation. I can even copy it, and I can go to, let's say, a tool like Insomnia, right? And I can say, hey, Insomnia, I want to basically import, create from the clipboard, import as a new design document, and there it is, Fluent API for Soapbox. There's my design document. There's my Swagger. You can see it validates it if I need to do something. There's my documentation that it builds. There's servers that I'm working with, the information for my API, all the paths for my API, right? I can start going into it. I can actually debug it, right? So I can actually see right here, I can actually start intercepting and sending requests right into, even with my defaults, right? Or I can actually build a test suite right here for all my design documents. So you have all these capabilities now just by working on your code, iterating, and producing your Swagger docs. All right, I took more time than Charlie. That's a first here, but I'm done. So we can open here to Q&A. But at least I got to show you this with some technical difficulties here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Luis. You do have kind of a lot of questions, but you also kind of went a little bit over. So if you could just kind of run through and find maybe like one or two that you could answer here real quick. We just want to make sure that we'll have time to get the next presenter all set up and get everything in place for Gavin, who will be coming up in a little bit. But are you seeing the Q&A area?
The Q&A, oh, there it is. Yep, looks great. Oh, we gotta check the guy who got Refactor first. I think it was Jeff somebody that got the prize. What about the layers are creating on Web3? Are we willing to communicate with those assets and make transactions with code? Jim Eisenhower did a cool one, which says, can you explain how multi-tenancy is handled using CFC's APIs capabilities? So this is mostly for routing. So in the router, you can actually deal with different domains as well. Okay, so I'll try to leave a link here for that. But you can have the ability to do different domains on your routing, and that can actually allow you for multi-tenancy. Okay. Where is this? Well, I'm going to leave it to the main router, and you can find it there. Okay. That's available. You can do that definitely. I know Mark is recording all these, right, Mark?
Yes. We had a little bit of an issue early on, so we missed a little bit of the beginning of your talk on the recording for this talk. But yes, all talks are being recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel probably in a day or two.
Yeah. So Steve had a good question. Steve. So modern means that you must use a framework, and if you're still doing things, just Adobe ColdFusion server installs, you're out of luck. No. Using a framework is really a choice, Steve, but at the end of the day, you actually will be building a framework in order to provide all these abstractions for you. That's what the framework really does, right? Is that when you build multiple projects, you don't want to be reusing or reinventing the wheel. You want to reuse the ecosystem. So you can do all these approaches of refactoring, fluency, BDD on pretty much anything, right? It doesn't even matter the language. But the idea of thinking that a framework is modern is just not really here. There's a lot of crappy frameworks out there too. So, it's not about that. It's about refactoring. It's about reusability. It's about making your code fluent in that sense. So whether you like it or not, you are building some type of framework, whether you're not using a framework or not. That's a good one. For purposes of security and overhead, would you prefer authentication, send credentials with every request and validate on every request? Send credential once, return on-off key, include auth key with subsequent requests and validate that. Martha, the latter is what we prefer. In CB security, we have a module for that, but basically providing JSON web tokens where you authenticate first, and then you actually get a short-lived key and a long-lived key if you want. And then you can use those for authentication and validation. That allows you to basically disconnect the plug if you need to, right? You can change and blacklist or remove those lists for those keys. So you can do a lot more in that approach than sending your credentials, which can be kind of tricky. Somebody can intercept that. I'll be posting the code on our blog as well and tweeting about it. We have a lot on security. I think Gavin in his next session will be actually showcasing some of these.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I am going to pull us into the outro here. Thank you so much, Luis, for your talk. Appreciate it. If you all could leave some feedback, this is really, really important for our speakers to find out how they did, help them out with continuing to improve. Coming up next in just about 49 minutes, Gavin will be talking about building applications with Vue.js and ColdFusion API. So please do not miss that. Again, thank you so much, Luis, for sharing your knowledge and experience. Apologies for some of the technical difficulties, but I think everyone got a ton of value today from you. So.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right.